Today we're going to be talking about an all-important feature of argumentative writing, which is the argument itself, or the claim. I'll talk about claims in this video in three parts. First, I'll loosely define argument through looking at some defining attributes you'll need to check off in your own writing. Then I'll illustrate claim formation through checking what I write to see if it has those attributes. Finally, I'll take a practical look at writing claims for academic readers, specifically the readers who prompt and grade the papers your claims are in. That is, your instructors. Let's start the discussion of claims with a little foreground. Arguments are a basic part of social life, from your dorm and your newsfeed to advertising and politics. Arguments do a lot of things. They organize truth, falsehood, half-truth, and bullshit in varied practice toward a variety of goals. Part of what we're here to do is to think critically about arguments as observers and practitioners. We'll be mainly doing that, however, by treating the very specific and technical example of academic writing, which I have found is helpful for understanding argument more broadly, but I've only found this after a lot of practice in it. So, this video is going to be restricted to talking about argument and claim making according to the conventions of American higher ed institutions, and really just the humanities and maybe the social sciences to an extent in academia at that. What I can present is only my own reflections on experience as a reader and writer in this context, and I invite you to collegial deliberation with me. Does my approach help you read and write? Does it present scholarship as you experience it? Does it apply to our crazy world of prophetic and diabolical rhetoricians? Let's keep these broad questions in mind while we focus on the specific task at hand. In that context, I'll define a claim as an argumentative statement that's defensible with analysis of specific evidence and is controvertible, which means that a reasonable reader of the paper's same sources should be able to disagree with the statement. All other things being equal, academic expository rhetoric is defined by claims, and claims are defined by these two attributes. Like we saw in the video on argument construction that compares writing to a pyramid, the claims are at the top of the pyramid, placed such that they are supported by everything else in the paper, literally. For that reason, I strongly urge you to write claims, especially the main claim, last or later in the writing process. Now let's quickly walk through a hypothetical example of refining a claim. For the purposes of the illustrative walkthrough, I will imagine claims written for a paper about a single primary source, which happens to be a formative document of ethical and political rhetoric. The primary source I'll be drawing on for this particular example of paper writing is Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Here is a citation to one of the more common print editions, and below there's also a link to the University of Pennsylvania's Africana Studies program for a digital reference. So, to take my example, I'll put out a couple statements about King's letter that I think are reasonable and are accurate, but that nevertheless don't quite fit the model of academic argument as defined by the two characteristics we cited. For the sake of the example, let's say I start out by arguing that King's letter significantly draws upon rhetoric characteristic of prophetic Christianity. To test the statement, I'll look at the two-item checklist, and I'll say that I don't think it's a defensible statement. Now, I'm not saying it's indefensible in the sense of being outrageously wrong. However, the defensibility we're interested in here is defensibility with specific evidence, and we can't find evidence to illustrate what is or isn't characteristic of a particular kind of rhetoric if we're just using one source. My statement might be of some use in a paper with a lot of primary sources that tries to say something about what prophetic Christianity is or isn't, but one source can't tell us anything about a bigger field of material we're not going to cite. However, in this situation, I'm telling myself not to despair, because with a little shifting of parameters, we'll have something that's defensible. To skip ahead through my imaginary trials and errors of other claims, I'll put out the statement that appeals to Christian tradition are central to King's argument. Here, the grounds of the argument, the full sense of what the paper's about, is the primary source and its constituent rhetorical elements. Here I can point to evidence in this text alone of what is most important to King's argument, and presumably what is less important. The source gives me all I need to defend this claim. Now let's look at the second item in the checklist, controvertibility. When I read my revised statement, could I imagine a reasonable reader disagreeing? In this case, I'm not really sure. I think it would be a stretch. The first lines of King's text address his audience of critics within particular Christian communities, and the text ends with a statement of faith that the church can be a liberatory force in the world. And in between, King refers to biblical, patristic, and pastoral authorities. So I'm thinking the Christian appeals are majorly important. I don't think I've made a controvertible statement. Not quite yet. However, this refining process has gotten me thinking about the relationship between appeals to authority in Christian traditions and other appeals in the text. So let me, for the sake of the example, get somewhere controvertible with these elements. I often advise writers who have a defensible claim that it's tough to disagree with to take their claims and pose the questions how, why, and to what effect. The reason for this is that we've got a statement we can accept, we just need to make it one that we don't necessarily have to accept. For the sake of the example, let me refine the claim more to say, King's persistent appeal to authority in Christian traditions do not restrict his argument. I'm putting this forward not as a final argument, but I am putting it forward as a claim that fits the form of conventional academic rhetoric if we're thinking about an undergrad paper that addresses just one source. In practice, we don't come up with claims out of thin air at all, but as part of the social dynamic of our work. Writing is a social act. Now, before you dust off your critical theory from the 70s and 80s, I mean this in a very simple minded way. When you write, you've got an audience. Someone is reading it. In the case of course papers, the main readers are people who have specifically asked you to write a specific kind of thing that they're evaluating on further specific terms. So it's in this way I'll talk about prompts. Unless the course instructor explicitly tells you differently, you should assume that the paper prompt is a way to get you thinking about how to produce a piece of academic expository rhetoric described by the rules we've talked about. It is very likely that at some point, an instructor will give you a prompt that is long, involved, a little redundant, and more than a little anxiety provoking. Maybe it'll look something like this. What? Yikes, I know. But let's read it over. In his letter from Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King makes a formative argument in political and religious thought. In some ways, a document of liberation theology, while in others, a work of speculative historical imagination and moral and social theory, the work is complex beyond its brevity. What are the major dynamics of the piece? Who is its primary audience? How do we know from the text? Does it work? How? Remember to cite your source. Okay, so I'm exaggerating for illustration, and not even I am that convoluted, but prompts have a way of bringing out the wordsmith in many scholars, who can be a little verbose as it is. You may then have the further complication of directions that tell you you actually don't need to answer all the questions, or maybe any of them, but those are just there to get you thinking. In this situation, I have seen students very logically choose those questions that are easiest to answer, which very logically are the questions at the lowest levels of the rhetorical pyramid. I have also seen students take the route of choosing their own questions and choosing questions they feel particularly confident in answering, which again, logically, are the more straightforward ones. Facing a daunting task, it makes sense to go with what you know. However, I've often seen students get their papers back with the comment that they didn't write controvertible arguments. So to avoid that outcome, my advice is to stick to the format and to write coherent, organized, and densely cited thesis-driven rhetoric, unless you're told not to, and let the prompt give you as much guidance as it can. For this prompt, I'd advise triage. How is it telling you about what kind of evidence you should find, how you should analyze it, and what question needs a response in the form of a thesis that all the rest of the paper supports? We can triage my weird example as follows. The first question I can ask is, what is it telling me to cite? Are there any specific parts of the text I have to talk about? Well, not apparently. The question about audience seems like a question of fact, Sort of, but it's interpretive at least a little. Then I can ask, what themes or issues should I address? This is at the level of analysis, the second stage of the rhetorical pyramid. Here I have no shortage of possibilities, but two big ones that stand out are religion and other. History, maybe society. These are big, broad topics, but they do tell us a lot about how to focus the paper. Finally, and most importantly, we should ask if there's a question in there that's directly answerable with the thesis, a defensible statement we can reasonably imagine different responses to. Here, the best candidate in that wacky prompt is, does it work? This is an evaluative question. It's a yes or no question. Now, the prompt does tell you can write whatever you want as long as it's thesis driven, but we have a question to guide our thinking and our search for evidence right there. If we organize the prompt this way, we can look on our earlier claim statement as a defensible, controvertible answer to it. Is it the best answer? We can't tell that without looking at the paper itself. However, we can also look at the lower level analytical or interpretive questions in the prompt and ask ourselves how fully and how explicitly we've answered them. You might be able to get away with ignoring them and presenting your own kind of analysis, but in the social dynamic of writing we're talking about here, we have some important information about how to relate to our primary readers. To conclude, you're facing a writing challenge when you're told you have to make a claim. It's a challenge not just because opinions require deliberation and ask you to put yourself out there, but also because academic writing has its own quirks and conventions no one comes to college knowing. However, the challenge can be manageable when we can practice bringing the welter of argumentative possibility into a structured creative process to get us our response.